in the most guarded halls of Buckingham Palace, where even whispers carry the weight of a death sentence, a covert war is unfolding. This isn't a battle fought with weapons or polished press releases. It is a war of power, legacy, and the secrets the British monarchy has tried to bury for decades. At the heart of this storm stand the two most powerful women in the institution, Princess Anne, the iron-willed guardian of tradition, and Queen Camilla, the woman who fought a lifetime to secure that crown. That night, the palace seemed to hold its breath. A high-level meeting at Clarence House, intended to be routine, spiraled into a psychological minefield when Princess Anne did something unprecedented. Known for her unwavering composure, she did not stand to offer a formal greeting. She did not offer the customary smile. Instead, Anne locked eyes with Camilla in a gaze that eyewitnesses described as cold, alienating, and filled with a chilling warning. "The time for hiding is over," Anne said, her voice low but echoing through the room like a funeral bell. That single sentence wasn't just aimed at Camilla. It struck at the very core of the defensive wall the Queen had built around King Charles III. Prince William, standing in the shadows of the doorway, went pale. He realized that the palace mask had finally slipped, exposing a reality far more dangerous than any public scandal. Why did Anne choose this moment to strike? Had she uncovered something within the classified files of Operation Seraphim? Or had she finally heard the secret tapes left by Diana, recordings where Camilla's name was whispered with a terror that could no longer be ignored? This isn't just royal drama, it's a survival test for the institution itself. Queen Camilla, who prides herself on controlling the narrative, blinked for the first time in years. She didn't argue. She didn't retreat. She simply clutched her pearls, her hands visibly shaking as she realized that Anne wasn't making an empty threat. Anne knows everything. She knows about the secret abdication plans, the altered medical reports, and most importantly, the truth about the prophecy involving the youngest child of the House of Windsor. Before we go deeper into the contents of this final warning, remember, in the world of the crown, the truth is never free. It comes with a devastating price, and tonight, Camilla may be the one who has to pay the bill. Are you ready to peel back the layers of this deception? Let's step into the shadows to decode the terrifying secret the palace swore to take to the grave. The tension in the music room at Clarence House didn't just evaporate. It thickened, turning into a suffocating silence that felt like a physical weight. Queen Camilla's sudden loss of composure was the first domino to fall in a sequence of events that the palace's internal security had spent years trying to prevent. For Princess Anne, the Iron Princess, this wasn't about a personal grudge. It was about the survival of the crown itself, a system that she believed was being poisoned from within. As William watched from the periphery, his mind raced through the briefings he had received regarding Operation Seraphim, the ultra-secret protocol designed to manage internal threats that no one in Parliament or MI5 was ever supposed to see. He realized that Anne's confrontation wasn't spontaneous. She had been digging through the royal intelligence files, and she had found the one thing Camilla thought was permanently deleted. It was a digital ghost, a log showing that someone had been accessing Princess Kate's private medical records and Prince Louis's psychological evaluations without authorization. Anne's voice, though low, carried the sharp edge of a military commander. "You thought you could insulate him, Camilla?" she whispered, leaning closer to the Queen. "You thought that by controlling the medical bulletins and managing the optics, you could control the legacy." The reference was clear. The palace had been caught in a lie of their own making, a web of privacy and planned recoveries that was actually a smokescreen for a deeper crisis involving the next generation of heirs. But the real leak wasn't a document. It was an emotion. Princess Anne had witnessed a moment at Windsor Castle that broke her stoicism. A moment where a young Prince Louis had asked a question that should never have been asked. "Why do they keep calling me dangerous?" The realization that the palace machine had turned its own blood into a threat was the final straw for Anne. Camilla's defense was a practiced mask of duty. She spoke of stability, of protecting the king's peace, and the necessity of secrecy in a modern world. But in the world of the House of Windsor, secrecy is a currency that loses its value the moment it's exposed. And didn't just have a theory. She had a recording, a second set of tapes that had survived the vault. These weren't the tapes the world knew about. These were the remission tapes, where the struggle for humanity against the institution was documented in raw, unedited detail, and held up a small, sealed envelope, the royal insignia glowing under the dim chandelier light. I didn't believe her then, Anne said, her eyes burning with a rare fire. I didn't believe Diana when she warned me about the machine you would build, but I see it now, and I won't let it swallow William's children. Camilla reached for the envelope, but Anne pulled it back. The warning was final. The palace had blinked, and in that split second, the power dynamic shifted. The queen realized that the Iron Princess wasn't just protecting a princess or a prince. She was protecting a truth that was about to set the entire monarchy on fire. The atmosphere in the room turned from cold to arctic as Princess Anne mentioned the remission tapes. For Queen Camilla, those tapes represented more than just a scandal. They were a direct threat to the carefully curated optics of the new reign. In the world of royal power, whoever owns the story owns the future, and Anne was making it clear that the palace machine no longer held the copyright. Anne stepped away from the queen, her shadow stretching across the portraits of monarchs past, as if the ancestors themselves were witnessing this reckoning. You spent decades trying to erase her footprint, Anne whispered, referring to Diana. But you forgot that her fire didn't die with her. It skipped a generation. This was the next-level threat the institution had feared, not a rebellion from the outside, but a psychological inheritance from within. The revelation centered on a specific file found in the deep archives, one marked with the dreaded Operation Seraphim seal. It wasn't just a medical record, it was a contingency plan, and had discovered that Camilla's advisors had been drafting a succession reset, a document that outlined how to manage a scenario where Prince William and Kate's influence became uncontrollable due to their rising public sympathy during Kate's illness. Camilla's response was a masterclass in deflection. She argued that the crown must be immortal, even if the humans wearing it are fragile. She spoke of the dignity of the institution, a word the palace often uses to avoid answering the question, who knew what and when? But Anne wasn't buying the palace spin. She knew that dignity was being used to cover up a cold-blooded assessment of the future queen's survival. The confrontation hit its peak when Anne revealed the final warning letter. It was a memo written by a retired intelligence officer who had worked closely with Queen Elizabeth II. The memo stated that the monarchy's survival depended not on its polished facade, but on its honest vulnerability, the very thing Kate had shown in her 94-second video, and the very thing the palace machine had tried to suppress. If you continue to treat Kate's recovery as a PR problem instead of a human struggle, you will lose the people, Anne warned. She was pointing to the cracks in the wall, the trust crisis that had been brewing since the faked photos and the months of abnormal silence. Anne was no longer just a sister-in-law. She was the guardian of the crown's last shred of public trust. As Camilla stood paralyzed, Anne delivered the ultimatum. If the queen didn't cease the succession reset and allow William and Kate to control their own narrative, and would ensure the remission tapes found their way to the one place the palace couldn't reach, the public's conscience. For the first time, the Iron Princess had threatened to burn the house down to save the family inside it. The air in the room didn't just feel cold. It felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out by the gravity of Anne's ultimatum. Queen Camilla realized that the succession reset was no longer a hidden blueprint in a dusty archive. It was a smoking gun. This document, drafted under the cover of Operation Seraphim, was the ultimate betrayal of blood for the sake of the institution. It wasn't just a contingency plan. It was a roadmap for a monarchy without the emotional weight of William and Kate. Princess Anne paced the room, her footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of judgment against the ancient floorboards. You called it institutional stability, Anne said, her voice dripping with cold skepticism. But we both know what it really is. An insurance policy against a future king who listens to his heart instead of your advisors. The palace machine had always feared William's humanity, but they feared Kate's honest vulnerability even more. The succession reset outlined a chilling strategy. If Kate's recovery remained uncertain in the eyes of the public, the palace would slowly diminish her role, replacing her presence with traditional duties managed directly by Camilla's circle. It was an attempt to control reality itself, to make the public forget the woman who had reset the monarchy's script. They wanted to return to a fairy tale monarchy, where nothing ever breaks, even as the walls were cracking in real time, and stopped in front of a window overlooking the dark gardens of London, her silhouette sharp against the glass. "You used privacy to manage the narrative," she noted. "But while you were managing optics, you were losing the people. The months of abnormal silence, the faked photos, and the cancelled schedules had created a crisis of trust that no polished press release could fix. The public wasn't just asking where Kate was. They were asking who the palace thought they were to hide the truth." Prince William, still standing by the door, felt the weight of the machine crushing his family's future. He realized that to the palace, his wife was a symbolic asset to be managed, while to him, she was the person he was terrified of losing. Anne's warning was clear. The institution was choosing self-preservation over the very human beings who kept it alive. As Camilla tried to regain her composure and delivered the most cutting observation of the night, "The monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, Camilla. It manages perception. And right now, the perception is that you are more afraid of a sick princess than you are of the truth." The final warning wasn't just about a letter or a tape. It was a demand to dismantle the machine before it swallowed the future king and queen. As the clock in the corner of the room chimed, marking the late hour, Princess Anne pivoted to the most sensitive piece of leverage she held: the connection between the current crisis and the gifts left behind by Diana. Queen Camilla had spent decades attempting to build a legacy of stability, but Anne was now dragging the ghost in the machine back into the light, and looked at the queen with a clinical, almost pitying sharpness. "You thought you had buried her influence in tributes and garden parties," Anne whispered. "But Diana knew this institution better than any of us. She knew that one day, the palace would try to crush a woman's spirit under the guise of dignity." The reference to Kate's current struggle was unmistakable. That honest vulnerability that Kate displayed in her video was the exact fire Diana had once used to push back against the palace machine, and then revealed a chilling detail from the private journals she had recovered: Diana's recorded visions about her grandchildren. She spoke of a boy born last who would carry the fire, and noted, referring to Prince Louis. And she warned that the palace would be so terrified of his spirit that they would try to label him dangerous before he could even find his voice. This wasn't just royal gossip. To Anne, it was a test of survival for the monarchy's soul. Camilla tried to dismiss it as superstition and emotional projection, but the remission tapes Anne held were proof of a recurring pattern. The tapes allegedly contained Diana's warnings that the institution would always choose optics over humanity, the very failure that had led to the current trust crisis surrounding Kate's missing months. Kate gave them what the machine never could, and stated flatly, she showed the world that a princess could bleed. The palace's attempt to revert to a fairy tale monarchy was not just a mistake. It was a fatal miscalculation in a modern world that demands authenticity. The ultimatum was now fully formed, and demanded that Camilla dismantle the succession reset and acknowledge that the future of the crown belonged to the people who could actually feel. "If you don't stop trying to control the narrative," Anne warned, "the truth will be dragged out at the last possible moment, and it will destroy the very gates you think you are guarding." As the silence stretched across the room, the power dynamic didn't just shift, it shattered. Princess Anne's revelation about the Diana prophecy wasn't just an emotional strike. It was a tactical maneuver designed to expose the internal rot of the palace machine. For Queen Camilla, the realization was chilling. The Iron Princess was no longer acting as a guardian of the throne, but as a protector of the human beings the throne was designed to consume. And leaned back, her eyes fixed on the queen with a clinical coldness. "You talk about dignity as if it's a shield," and said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "But in reality, it's a shroud. You're using it to bury the truth about Kate's recovery because the succession reset can only work if the public believes she is no longer capable." This was the next level deception. The idea that the palace wasn't just waiting for Kate to get better. They were actively preparing for a future where she was sidelined. The months of abnormal silence, the faked photos, and the canceled schedules were not accidents. They were part of a panic management strategy, and revealed that she had intercepted a memo from the palace's internal security unit. The memo, coded under Operation Seraphim, suggested that Kate's honest vulnerability was a liability to the fairy tale monarchy the palace desperately wanted to restore. They didn't want a princess who could bleed. They wanted a symbol that could be controlled. Kate gave them what the machine never could, honest vulnerability, and repeated, her voice echoing the core failure of the current administration. And yet, your first instinct was to hide it, to spin it, and to try and control the reality of her cancer. The trust crisis wasn't caused by the illness. It was caused by the palace spin that treated a human tragedy like a PR disaster. Princess and then delivered the most devastating blow of the night. She revealed that Prince William had already been briefed on the Remission Tapes. The future king was no longer a passive observer of the machine. He was now its most dangerous adversary, and looked at Camilla, who was visibly shaken, and said, "If a king has to overrule his entire court just to tell the truth, then the court has already failed." The warning was clear. The old guard was fracturing. If the queen didn't dismantle the succession reset and allow the truth to be told, the Iron Princess would ensure that the palace's last line of defense became its own undoing. The air in the room remained arctic as Princess and moved from tactical warnings to the ultimate existential threat facing the monarchy. The legacy of the woman they tried to silence. And looked at Queen Camilla, her gaze clinical and unforgiving. "You treated Kate's cancer as a PR disaster to be managed," and whispered, her voice echoing the next-level failure of the palace machine. "But you failed to realize that her honest vulnerability didn't just win hearts. It reset the monarchy's script entirely," and pointed to the succession reset document lying on the table, a cold assessment of Kate's symbolic asset value. The months of abnormal silence, the faked reassurance photos, and the canceled schedules weren't just mistakes. They were a failed attempt to protect a fairy tale monarchy that no longer existed. The public didn't want polished palace lines. They wanted the truth, and the palace had chosen secrecy over humanity. Kate gave them what the palace machine never could, and stated, her eyes sharp. She showed that an ancient institution could be human, that it could bleed, and that it could suffer in real time. The honest vulnerability Kate displayed in her 94-second video was a form of pushback that the advisors of Operation Seraphim were terrified of, a future queen who owned her own story, and then delivered a chilling revelation regarding the Diana prophecy. She noted that the palace's current panic management mirrored the exact patterns used decades ago to isolate Diana. "You are using dignity to avoid answering who knew what and when," and noted, "but while you manage the optics, you are losing the one person who humanizes the crown." The ultimatum reached its peak as and demanded a total halt to the succession reset. She made it clear that if the queen continued to allow the machine to treat Kate as a liability, the Iron Princess would ensure the public saw the Remission Tapes, proof that the palace had prioritized institutional stability over a mother's survival. "The monarchy is not a fairy tale anymore," and warned, her voice final. "It is a test case for survival. And right now, Camilla, you are failing the test." The palace had blinked, and for the first time, the Iron Princess was prepared to let the walls crumble to save the family inside them. The clock in the Clarence House study ticked with a rhythmic precision that felt like a countdown to the end of an era. Princess and stood her ground, her silhouette a sharp contrast against the heavy velvet curtains. She looked at Queen Camilla, not with anger, but with the cold detachment of a judge delivering a final verdict. This wasn't transparency, and whispered, her voice cutting through the stale air. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment. The next-level deception that and had uncovered was the palace's calculated attempt to use Kate's recovery as a tactical pause in the succession narrative, and pointed to the reports from Operation Seraphim, which revealed that the abnormal silence and the faked reassurance photos were part of a panic management strategy. They hadn't been protecting Kate's privacy. They had been protecting the institution's image from the honest vulnerability that Kate was determined to show. "You don't lose sight of a princess for months by accident," and noted, her eyes locked on Camilla's shaking hands. The months of missing schedules and cancelled engagements were not for rest. They were the result of a system reaching its breaking point, terrified that the woman who holds the emotional center of the monarchy would finally speak for herself. And then brought up the most devastating piece of evidence: the remission memos. These documents showed that while the public was being fed a fairy tale narrative of a planned and successful surgery, the internal circle was already drafting contingency plans for a monarchy without a future queen. Kate gave them what the machine never could: honest vulnerability, and repeated. And your response was to try and control reality itself. The warning was no longer a suggestion. It was an ultimatum, and demanded that the succession reset be dismantled immediately. She made it clear that if the palace continued to prioritize optics over the humanity of its members, she would ensure the public understood the true cost of the crown's secrecy. If the monarchy wants to survive, and concluded, her voice low and dangerous, it can't go back to pretending nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. The palace had blinked, and in that moment of weakness, the Iron Princess had seized the script. The psychological warfare inside Clarence House had reached its absolute zenith. Princess and stood as the personification of honest vulnerability, pushed to its limit, her presence a stark contrast to the crumbling facade of Queen Camilla. The next-level crisis was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a reality that had seen the most carefully controlled institution in Britain admit it was hiding how close it came to losing the one person who makes it feel human. Anne's voice turned into a razor-thin whisper, cutting through the silence of the room. "You don't lose sight of a princess for months by accident," she stated, her words echoing the suspicion that had gripped a nation. The succession reset was the ultimate proof of a system more afraid of truth than of scandal. A system that had prioritized the fairy tale monarchy over the survival of Kate, the woman who held the monarchy's emotional center. The Iron Princess pointed to the faked reassurance photos and the months of abnormal silence as the primary cause of the current trust crisis. It wasn't just about Kate's illness. It was about who gets to own the story, and revealed that the Remission Tapes documented a king and his heir visibly shaken, finally admitting that Kate's condition was far more serious and far more dangerous than the palace machine ever allowed the cameras to see. Kate didn't just update her medical chart. She rewrote the monarchy's script, and noted, her gaze fixed on the queen. The palace had tried to control reality itself, but in doing so, they had reached a breaking point where the mask had finally slipped. The dignity Camilla claimed to protect was revealed to be a shroud for panic management. The ultimatum was now a final sentence, and demanded that the palace acknowledge it can bleed. She made it clear that if the machine continued to choose secrecy over human vulnerability, the Iron Princess would no longer be a guard at a gate she no longer believed in. If the monarchy wants to survive, she warned, it can't go back to pretending nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. Camilla's silence was the sound of an ancient institution realizing it was mortal. The Iron Princess had forced the crown to look into a mirror, and the reflection was a family on the brink, bound by a pain that could no longer be managed with polished press releases. The clock struck the final hour of the night, and the silence in Clarence House felt like the weight of an entire empire. Princess and stood by the door, her hand resting on the handle, not as a guest leaving a room, but as a sentinel closing a chapter of history. She turned back one last time to Queen Camilla, who remained seated in the dim light, looking smaller than the throne she occupied. This was the night the palace blinked, "Camilla," and said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more power than a royal decree. "You tried to gamble with the one thing the crown cannot afford to lose, its soul. You thought you could manage Kate's suffering as if it were a budget deficit, and in doing so, you proved exactly why the machine is failing." The succession reset was now dead in the water. Anne's final act was the delivery of a sealed envelope, not a legal document, but a set of instructions for the transition of power. It stipulated that from this moment forward, the honest vulnerability Kate displayed would be the new standard, not the exception. The faked photos, the months of abnormal silence, and the cold-blooded optics management were over. If the monarchy was to survive, it would be as a family first and a firm second. As Anne stepped out into the crisp night air, the palace's internal security logs recorded the end of the lockdown. But the world outside had changed. The Diana prophecy had not just been a warning. It had been a roadmap. The fire that had skipped a generation had finally ignited, and it was being carried by a future king and queen who refused to be ghosts in their own home. Queen Camilla was left alone in the music room, the echoes of Anne's warning still vibrating against the walls. The remission tapes remained on the table, a haunting reminder that the truth is a fire that cannot be contained. The institution had survived, but the illusion of invincibility was gone. The crown had been forced to bleed, to suffer, and to admit its own mortality. The final image was one of Prince William and Princess Kate, appearing together on a private balcony, away from the prying eyes of the palace machine. They weren't wearing crowns. They were holding hands. As the sun began to rise over London, the message to the world was clear. The fairy tale is over. The reality has begun. And for the first time in centuries, the monarchy was no longer guarding a secret. It was guarding its humanity.